Welcome to The World Awaits.
Travel tales to inspire your wanderlust.
I'm Kirsty Bedford, journalist, editor and travel writer.
And I'm Belinda Jackson, author, travel journalist and columnist, and we're your weekly co-hosts.
Welcome back to The World Awaits. How are you all? I just spent a magical weekend at Phillip Island and walked, that will be no surprise to anyone, and I walked the Cape Woolamai Walk. We did the Beacon Track, it's actually the highest point on the island, which doesn't feel like that when you're up there. But for anyone who wants to do it, basically it's this really stunning scenic walk that starts along Woolamai Beach, and then you climb the stairs at the end and walk along the cliffs. It's about 7.5k, so it sounds really short, but actually it's kind of steep in parts, so it does take longer than you think. So amazing walk and stunning coastal views, and we saw loads of wallabies, which always gets me every time. But you've been on a big hike, Belle, so tell us about where you hiked this weekend. It's much bigger than mine.
Well, not a weekend, it was a whole week actually. I have to spend 6 days on Flinders Island, which is one of the islands in the Bass Strait. So to get there, I had to fly to Launceston in northern Tassie and then took a seaplane to Flinders Island, which is about 45 minutes flight into the Bass Strait for 6 days walking with World Expeditions.
Amazing. So was it really different distances each day, or how did it go as far as how many Ks you were doing?
Yeah, well, the first day we had only a half day, so we just sort of stretched our legs and did a really lovely short coastal walk. And then each day was different. Some days we were walking following the coastline. Other days we jumped up onto peaks like Mount Killimbacrankie, and the biggie is Mount Strzelecki, which is not the longest day. I mean, it was kind of weird because when I was reading the trip notes, it's like, well, that's just 6 kilometres. We only walked 6 kilometres in one day. And I think we had a conversation about this before I went. I was like, I don't know, I think the numbers are out or something's weird. But this is a climb to the highest peak on the island, and you start pretty much at sea level and you go up to 756 kilometres. But it was straight up. So we were covering about 1 kilometre an hour walking. Like the pace that was being set, and there was a small group of us, but the pace was to be constant and sustainable. So instead of, and I've got to say I'm a bit guilty of this when I'm hiking, pushing it out, having a little collapse, pushing it out, having a little collapse. This was more like moving constantly. And so we climbed up Mount Strzelecki, got up to the top of the mountain, and it was just incredible views because this is a group of islands, the Furneaux group, and they've all got very different histories. Can I tell you about one of those islands? And if you don't like snakes, then maybe tune out at this point. But there's an island off the coast of it, not that far off, that I was constantly looking at this island off the west coast of the Flinders, and it's called Mount Chapel Island. It has a breed of tiger snakes on it that have that have morphed, evolved. So they've got bigger heads, and I know, it's so gross. And they live on the mutton birds that breed on the island. So for about 5 weeks of the year, they gorge themselves on mutton bird chicks, and the rest of the year they just kind of starve. But it has one of the highest concentrations of tiger snakes in the world. And there is, like, it's just insane. There's an airstrip on it. And I was like, why would anybody have an airstrip go to this, to me, one of the 7 hells, right? But rangers monitor this stuff, and there's like, and literally there'll be like, he put his foot down and there'll be 4 snakes there.
Oh, God.
I know, absolutely horrific. But very little snakes on Flinders Island. I shouldn't have diverted into that one. One of the features of the walks was the wildlife. It was just amazing. I mean, there were little Bennett's wallabies everywhere who were just gorgeous with their sweet little faces, and rounded paddy melons loping around the joint. Wombats all over the joint. Like we drove one late one afternoon down what I've renamed Wombat Alley, and it was just, you just saw them roaming across the paddocks with their babies following behind them, and you'd hear a little rustle in the bushes and there'd be a wombat taking off. It was, it was just spectacular, and they're so isolated, these islands. They're in the Bass Strait, so you think you'd be freezing your chops off, but I actually swam in the most pristine water.
Oh.
Warm water. I know, it was
amazing.
It was astonishing. And just these gorgeous curves of beach with nobody else on them. So you hike for half a day, stop, have lunch, have a swim, and then finish the second half of your day hiking. It was a really gorgeous, gorgeous experience. And The food was amazing because we were with guides the whole time. There was only 6 of us on my group and then the 2 guides. And they do all of the catering and the accommodation, of course.
Amazing. Sounds so good. The thing is about seeing wildlife like that, you just never get tired of it. I don't know. It's just remarkable. Every time I know it's the same at Phillip Island, seeing all those wallabies jumping around, bouncing about, and wombats and kiddas, you just never seem to get tired of it. And also it says a lot, doesn't it, about the region and the way, the health of the ecosystem when you've got that many wildlife around. But so where did you actually stay? Were you in Swags?
No, we weren't in Swags. World Expeditions and Tasix has its own permanent camp there. So they've got it's an eco camp, very, very low impact, which means they're using rainwater for everything, and they've got these gorgeous little pod tents, and they have I love this so much. They have a clear roof on them, so it's clear plastic. So at night you just look up at the stars, which was just beautiful. And the weather was really mild for us. They run these walks only from October to April because that's where you've got the best weather. I have to say that early to mid-February, brilliant, like just so brilliant. We had almost no wind, those gorgeous bright days. The packing list for these sorts of things, because they always give you a packing list about what you should have. I had thermals in there. I had, my winter hiking gear. I had my windproof jacket and all of that. So it was like, oh my goodness, a bag just full of things that I never used, really. So it was really warm weather hiking, a decent pair of boots and great guides and fantastic food. I've got to say the guides are amazing because they run up a mountain and then drive us back to camp, and then they suddenly whip up a 3-course meal, and you're like, well, this is pretty nice.
Nice. And I love that it's a relatively, it's a new old walk, isn't it? So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's only been running for about a year. That Tasmanian Expeditions, which is an arm of World Expeditions, has been running it. But as I was talking to one of the guides, Matt Griffiths was saying, they're refining it as well. They're refining the walk, so it's really coming into its own now. And it's just been named one of it's the newest of the great walks of Australia, and that's a list of 13 great hikes around the country, which I've done some, and Tassie seems to have a bit of an over-representation. So you've got things like Overland.
But when you say refining it, do you mean did they refining it as in because of the amazing food experiences attached to it that you're saying, or literally are they changing where you walk?
I think that they are just. I think that it's working out where the best walks are and how you link them together as well. Because we did a lot of. There are a couple of one-day walks, but then it might be which you've got to change for weather, because one of the days we had was 31 degrees, and that was the day we were supposed to be climbing up mountains. It was like it would have been a horror. So instead, we did a coastal walk that had lots of swimming points, and then we also went in and did a bit of the social history on the island, because Flinders Island had been used as a place for Aboriginal missions, or reservations, which was really, ultimately incredibly tragic. It's funny that there sort of had been, at the time of colonisation, there hadn't been traces of Aboriginal people living on Flinders Island, so it doesn't have an Indigenous name, and it didn't have that history until particularly Aboriginal women from Tasmania were taken against their will as wives by the whalers and sealers who used to live on these islands. And it was, it's really, it was quite good because it gave us a chance to really reflect on what that social history is of Tasmania, of Flinders Island, and of Australia. And that's being recorded in a really beautiful little museum on the island. So I really like that, and getting a chance to look at the towns are tiny. And if you go onto my Instagram, free plug from my Instagram here, you will see I'm waiting at the airport to get picked up, and it's basically the airport is a mowed strip of grass.
Yeah, I love that. It's so cute.
And as the guides were saying, and there's plenty of toilets around, just pick a tree. So yeah, very, very low maintenance. The flight over was just astonishing. You're flying over the northern coast of Tassie, and you really see that these islands were part of, at one point connected. I was so close to you. You were on Phillip Island. I was not that far on Flinders Island, and they used to connect. It used to connect up with Wilson's Prom, and to the point where actually Bass Strait was a lake. Like, it's just the geological history is sensational. So yeah, you really got to check it out.
All right, well, you can check out all of the Great Walks of Australia at greatwalksofaustralia.com.au, and we'll obviously put the links in the show notes too. So that just sounds amazing. You know how much I love hiking. So, and I've got some hikes coming up this year, which I'll talk about later on. So I'm really excited about. So, all right, so moving on, and our latest bit of travel info for you this week, and we're revealing the world's friendliest accents. Don't get us started on Kiwi versus Aussie. So, because I think I sound like an Aussie. I forget that actually I don't.
Well, are you getting there?
I've lived here so long. So new research shows that 6 in 10, well, there you go. I just gave it away, right? And 10 people believe that others had made subconscious judgments about them based on their accent or how they speak, with accent bias dictating job prospects, level of attractiveness, intelligence, and even friendliness.
Yeah, well, the survey was global. It does come from a company for casino goers called minimumdepositcasinos.org, but the findings might surprise you. So apparently, Americans have the highest odds of being considered friendly, with 1 in 5 respondents deeming the American accent to be the friendliest. And then British comes in second, and the Australian accent was the third most friendly accent.
Well,
so what do you reckon?
Yeah, well, I was away on the weekend with a number of very well-travelled friends, and I did a little bit of vox pop on this, and they were horrified at the fact that the Americans came out on top. I think it's because of those, and look, no offence to Americans out there, but I just think that, sometimes when you're travelling, and I think, particularly in years gone by, and there's Americans on a tour or something, they can just be particularly loud. But that's got nothing really to do with this, because this was all about how friendly that the accent was considered. So it's interesting it'll be interesting how the criteria came about, right? Because how do you determine what's the friendliest accent? But anyway, so as voted by however people wanted to determine it, my friends found it very surprising that Americans topped the list, and they were all Australians. So there you go. That might be one of the reasons why. So next on the list was the Canadian accent came in fourth, and then that was followed by, oh my God, wait for the spell, by German and French accents.
That German thing blows my mind. But like when the baddie in the movie is, what accent are we going to? They choose the German accent. So I mean, look, I think that the survey is flawed in many ways, in that a southern US accent is so different to someone from the north. And look, I have to confess, I cannot confidently pick a Canadian accent from somebody from northern USA. Yeah. And get this, Norwegians received the least amount of votes, which made them the least friendliest. But that is probably because nobody really knows what a Norwegian accent is like. I mean, there's only 5 million of them, right? What about the Irish ones? And what is a British accent? What's a British accent? Is it somebody from Manchester? Is it somebody from Northern Ireland?
I don't know. Even look at close to home, like even in Australia and New Zealand, the accents vary so much from the south to the north. So,
my goodness, we had a pilot. My pilot yesterday was from Burnie in northern Tassie, and he was not rushing. He was not rushing anything, including his speech, and he just kicked right back. And I was like, "Yep, we're gonna take the plane up." And I was like, yeah. I felt very safe, very capable. He was extremely friendly. Very different to, what somebody sounds like from Canberra, right?
Yeah, well, in New Zealand, in Invercargill, which is the southernmost town on South Island, they actually roll their R's. So it's
a Scottish thing.
Yeah, so very, very distinctive. And you comparable to someone in Auckland who sounds very, very different. So yeah, it is. It's a very interesting. But we will put the full list in the show notes, and you can have a read through and have a bit of a giggle, because you're probably screaming at the moment walking along, as my friends were on the weekend listening to this, about the American accent being the most friendly.
You're listening to The World Awaits. We'd love it if you could leave us a rating and review on your favourite podcast platform.
My guest this week is Tony Wheeler, who is one of the most recognisable names in travel. Anyone who's ever used a Lonely Planet guidebook will have read the story on the last page about how he and his wife Maureen wrote and published their first guidebook across Asia on the cheap on their kitchen table in 1973. It was following a backpacking honeymoon through Asia, and they finally sold the Lonely Planet Piamos in 2011 for a few $100 million. I backpacked for decades with a Lonely Planet guide somewhere at hand, in book or online, so it's enormously exciting to meet the man who started it all, and I'm sure you're going to love hearing from him too. Tony, welcome to The World Awaits. It's so lovely to have you here.
Good morning.
As we mentioned in the intro, you and your wife Maureen wrote your first guidebook after you honeymooned backpacking through Asia. What was travel like then in the early 70s?
Well, it was different in some ways, and in other ways it was not different at all. If you look at the numbers, I think Thailand at that time was getting 100,000 tourists a year. And I've got to say, in Bangkok, it seemed like there were quite a lot of tourists around. But compared to, I don't know what the number is now, but 10 million probably wouldn't be a bad guess. And that's a big difference. So the numbers are very different. And of course, many of the things that we're very used to in travel today, the sort of instant communication, the information by social media, the ability to do things on the internet, none of that existed. So in many ways it was different. But on the other hand, I go back to places today and I think, well, this doesn't seem very different to me at all.
But then the style of traveling as well. I mean, that whole the backpacking concept is. Sometimes I see backpackers in airports and I think, oh, look at you! I love it that you can still see people backpacking. Is the way that we travel so different now in that sense?
Well, again, I'm going to say yes and no, because if people want to sort of get off the beaten track and really be backpacking and traveling, not necessarily they're traveling on a shoestring because they're backpacking, they're traveling on a shoestring because there's no other choice. They're so far off the beaten track. If they want to do that, they still can. On the other hand, there are lots of people who their mothers know where they are every step of the way, which kind of horrifies me.
I'm in two minds about that as a mother, but then I did enjoy signing out for months and months and months on end without anybody knowing where I was. So that is a dramatic difference. Has your own style of travel changed since you wrote that book? I mean, the world has changed, but the way you approach travel.
I'm going to keep saying yes and no to all these questions. And
do you fly on luxury jets now? That was my question.
If I'm, what do they say? When you board the aircraft, once you turn left, you never turn right again.
And
I can agree with that. Although, if I'm just going to fly up from Melbourne to Sydney, or if I'm going somewhere in Europe, it's only an hour or two, I'm going to be on Ryanair or Jetstar or an economy. I'm not going to be on a chartered aircraft. But if I'm flying 25 hours, or even across the Atlantic Ocean, I really do prefer business class. So yeah, and I can afford it. If I've got a choice between the place with bed bugs or the 5-star hotel, you'll find me heading towards the 5-star hotel. But again, there are lots of places in the world. If you want to go there, you've got no choice. You're going to be roughing it. You're going to be backpacking because there isn't a 5-star hotel down the road.
Right, that's a great answer. And I know that you've been interviewed hundreds of times about travel. You've written probably thousands of articles about it, books everywhere. But time changes opinions as well. So I'm going to run a quick fire list of questions past you. And these are the questions that I think most people to expect to hear from you. And you have probably answered 1,000 times, but sometimes these things change. So are you ready to shoot through the list?
Fire away.
Okay, so favourite country?
I've got so many favourite countries. But look, who doesn't love Italy? Every time you go to Italy, you think, I can understand why this works so well.
Yeah, I love it too. a favourite city or town or village?
Okay, I've got lots of those as well, but the one I've really had good times with in the last few years is in Bulgaria, Plovdiv. And I went there about 5 years ago, and I thought, what an interesting town. So much so that I went back last year, and Maureen, my wife, and we took a bunch of friends, and they were all blown away by Plovdiv as well. So yeah, let's go to Plovdiv in Bulgaria. Great name.
Plovdiv. It is a great name and a fun town as well. I think I'm with you on that. And where was your last trip?
I did a number of trips last year. I was really all over the place last year. But one of them, an area I'd never been to before, I went to South America, Bulgaria. Bulgaria's in Europe. I went to Uruguay and Paraguay. I'd never been to either country before. They're side by side. Arriving in Uruguay, you get to leave Buenos Aires and take the ferry across, an Australian ferry as well, remarkably, across the River Plate and land in Uruguay. I had a good time in both those countries.
Yeah, and the market scene and the food is fantastic as well. So where are you going to next?
I'm going to Adelaide in a week or two, and I'll be going to Africa in about 6 weeks' time.
Whereabouts in Africa are you going?
Oh, the darker places. I'll talk about them afterwards.
Okay. The place you will never return to.
There's no place I'd never return to. There's lots of places, I've been there enough times that in some ways they're almost too familiar. But, you could still take me back to Singapore. I can still line up and have a South Indian vegetarian or a Hainanese chicken rice and feel, hey, Singapore's not so bad.
Okay. Best souvenir, if you actually do bring souvenirs home with you.
Well, I brought in lots of things. I just looking around the room I'm in now, I can see a few things on the wall or on a shelf that have come from various places. One of my amusing souvenirs that I really like is scuba diving in Port Phillip Bay off Melbourne, and going by what used to be the old quarantine station a century and a half ago, and just picking up this broken cup there'd been a big storm and the seabed was sort of stirred up a bit, and I just found this fragment of a cup that somebody hanging around in quarantine before they were allowed into the city of Melbourne a century and a half ago had dropped overboard, probably in frustration. And there it has sat for over 100 years waiting for me to pick it up.
What a great souvenir of a really fascinating part of Melbourne's history. And the last one in this hit of questions, the one thing you always pack, possibly the thing that you have carried that saved your life.
Look, I know someone who did this once, because really, what do you need when you go traveling? You really need two things. You need your passport and a credit card. If you've got those two things, you can go. And this guy thought it would make an interesting article to leave home and take the Uber to the airport or whatever with nothing on me apart from the clothes I'm wearing, a credit card so I can get money out of the first ATM I come to, and a passport, which you had to have, and then see what you need. Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to buy a change of clothes and a toothbrush and, see where it goes from there. But you don't really need much. And we've all, I hope we're not all, but I've had the experience of, getting there and finding your bag hasn't come with you. And I'm better now at having generally I only travel with a carry-on anyway. So I've got everything. If my carry-on's gone, then I really am in trouble. But you don't need too much. And I think minimizing what you take with you is a really good idea.
Oh, that is fascinating. Does that work? You'd have to choose where you went, though, wouldn't you? I mean, if you were going to Finland in midwinter or something like that, you'd have to... But
then you wear all that heavy stuff on the plane, don't you? Yeah. You get on the plane with your gloves on and Yeah, it is more difficult. And, I've done trips where you're trying to do two things. You're going to be doing some hiking and backpacking, but then at some point you have to have a jacket, not necessarily a tie, but dress up a little bit, and then it does make the carry-on problem more difficult. But I got to say, I generally manage it. It's very rare that I go on a trip where I need more than a carry-on bag.
I'm so impressed. You don't carry a laptop with you, or
I carry my
camera.
Well, I don't carry a camera anymore. I mean, that all goes just on a telephone, on a phone. The phones are so good for photographically these days. But otherwise, I mean, but what I say is basically, you are not, when you're traveling, you're not meeting the same people over and over again unless you're in a group. If you're by yourself, whoever you meet today doesn't know what you wore yesterday, doesn't realize you've only got 3 bits of clothing. One of them you're wearing, one of them is drip drying on the shower rail in the hotel, and one of them is about to be washed to be drip drying. You can get away with a lot less than you think.
So essentially, you've answered your first question, my first question, which was, has your style of travel changed? And to a degree, it hasn't really, has it? I mean, if when you're doing those sort of long distance treks through places like Asia, you do strip back. You find 20 things to do with the sarong and all of that sort of thing. So maybe you haven't come as far as what you think.
I sort of feel I've got better at it. I look at what I used to carry with me, and really, if anything, I've certainly the camera thing. I used to be, and I'm still like taking photographs, but I used to carry a camera with a telephoto lens and a wide-angle lens and everything else. And that was definitely a weight. And I'd got down to carrying just a small hand point-and-shoot camera. And I've really, in the last year or two, even dropped that. And then if I can't take it with a phone, it isn't worth taking.
Wow, that is inspirational. Okay, I'm taking it on board. I try to cram everything in, and then I pull half of it out the night before, and then I find that I've dropped that fundamental piece of whatever it was that I...
Yeah, well, they say, do what you do. They say, pack it up, then take half of it out, and then take twice as much money.
I think I'm living on that one. I do empty half of my pack as I go, because I don't want to be that person that can't carry their own luggage. I think that there's something, there's something so, you're so reliant on others. And I do believe in the kindness of strangers to help you out. But I think that when you've packed so much luggage, you can't lift it, then strangers don't have to. Well, and strangers don't have to be kind, do they?
No, not at all. Not in that situation. You're look, come on, we all have to learn. We don't sort of step off on our first trip knowing everything. It's all experience.
That is an amazing question. So there is an art to travel, isn't there, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think, as you travel more, you do learn what, not to make mistakes. And I'm going to make some more. I'll do this wrong and that wrong. But hopefully, if you don't learn something, well, you're not getting any older, right?
No. Well, what do you think your biggest mistake has been then?
Oh, I've made terrible mistakes. I've only ever once lost a passport, and amazingly, it didn't cause me as much trouble as it could have done, because losing your passport can be a really, really bad experience. You can be stuck in a country, you can be trekking for days to get to somewhere you can replace it. So, I've been fortunate that's only ever happened to me once, and in a comparatively minor fashion. But, I've had the odd thing stolen. I've only ever once been really mugged, whereas, someone did hold a knife to me, and, I handed over my camera instantly. But, other times I've had things stolen, I can generally think, oh, that was stupid of you. I wasn't being careful enough in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask where you were mugged? I'm sure that the country's tourism board is not going to thank me, but I want to know.
I'm embarrassed about it because it was in Bogota in Colombia, and I've had such good times in Colombia, and I've got a couple of really good Colombian friends. One of them, I was on the way to his apartment in Bogota, and I got there and I said, "You wouldn't believe what's just happened to me. I've just been mugged." "Oh no, Tony," he said. "So what do you know?"
Okay, right. I'm sorry, Colombia. I wonder, do you think, though, you're saying that the travel is, you learn as you travel, and so many of us are traveling now. Have we reached peak travel? Do we still live on a lonely planet? I mean, Venice has touristed out. We found all of those tribes in PNG. Everyone's done Machu Picchu, and if we haven't done them, then we've watched 1,000 TikTok videos on them. Do you think that we have lost the wonder in travel?
I I'm getting very good in this interview saying yes and no.
That's okay.
Because, I mean, we have been everywhere and we've seen the Instagram moments. And, nobody goes to the Taj Mahal at Agra without having seen 1,000 pictures of it from different angles and everything else. But Venice, I think, is a really good example because I've always said Venice is the perfect example of 2 streets over, or in case of Venice, it'll be 2 canals over. You leave St. Mark's Square and you go a couple of canals away and suddenly it's all different. And I've been in Venice in the last 6 months. Maureen, my wife's been there twice in the last year. But we were both there last October and we stayed at a hotel. We didn't even organize it ourselves. We were there to speak at a travel Festival of Ideas, it was called. And they organized the hotel for us. And, it was only a 20-minute walk, perhaps, from St. Mark's Square. But it seemed like another part of Venice. And one of the things we liked, we'd go out in the late afternoon to have a sort of a too early sundowner. And we'd be sitting there and we'd be watching kids come home from school. And we thought, wow, there still are schools in Venice. There are still kids going to school in Venice. And that's a good eye-opener. We're so used to saying, it's just all it is these days is tourists. And when you go to a part of Venice where, okay, there are tourists there, but there aren't as many, and there are also locals there, that's a really good thing.
I think that is a great reminder of Venice. It is so different once you, as you say, once you step off that highway, that
intense, crowded area in the centre. Once you get a little bit away from that, I mean, and it's a shame. So, the number of tourists in proportion to the number of locals has probably used to be 90% locals, 10% tourists. Now it's 90% tourists and 10% locals. And Venice is, of course, a bad example. There's lots of other places. A place in Italy that I often point to is Ravenna, the city with the beautiful mosaics. And it's not far from anywhere, it's only a short train ride from Bologna or Rimini. And yet you go there and you sort of feel, where are the tourists? This is a place that deserves lots of tourists, and it hasn't, and you aren't crowded out by tourists. So, even in Italy, there are different places.
That's such a great reminder and a great tip too for Italy because we love it, and maybe we've loved it a little too hard in places. Okay, all right.
There was a great line from Frank Zappa from the Mothers of Invention, who said, if you're going to be a country, you need a beer, a football team, and an airline. And I thought that's good. I would disqualify Saudi Arabia, which is probably a good thing. But the beer, the football team, and the airline. Taiwan definitely qualifies as a country. Just because China doesn't like Taiwan doesn't stop it being a country. Or Antarctica. Antarctica is definitely not a country, but it is a whole continent. So I don't think you could claim you were really well travelled if you hadn't been to Antarctica. So you'd have to go, if you wanted to say you'd been everywhere, you'd have to go to at least 193. And there's lots of other ones that I would say are countries, even though they aren't in the UN, and some people may not define them as such.
Such as where, would you say?
Well, I'd say French Polynesia. It's a colony, so it's not an independent country, but it's got 2 airlines. It's got a domestic airline and an international airline. I'm sure it's got a football team. It's certainly got an outrigger canoe rowing team. That's, an international sport. And they've got their own currency. And a very good beer.
And beer.
Hinano beer. Yeah, I can even name the beer.
Right. So that's another one to add to the list.
That's definitely a country.
Right. Because, last year, you were saying just in 2023, you had caught trains in 12 different countries.
Yeah, actually, I added a 13th later on because in December I was in New Zealand and I took the train from Auckland to Wellington. So I had a 13th train country in 2023.
Do you find when you travel then, sometimes you think, I haven't been to that country yet. I would like to tick it off. Are you guilty of playing, that game on the internet where you block out which countries you've been to so that you can count how many you visited? Or is that just me?
Look, Maureen would say this is definitely a boy thing and a nerd and geek thing, and you shouldn't do it. But yeah, I do keep track of them, and if I was just counting indiscriminately, I think I'm around 200, but that's adding all the Antarcticas and the French Polynesias and the Gibraltar. It's more or less like a country, I think, or the Falkland Islands or Islas Malvinas if I'm in South America. That's a country as well, I think.
So
Yeah, Egypt. There's a place indeed.
It is.
I was there. I could claim the last night before the pandemic, shut everything down. I was in Cairo because I'd been to Socotra, the island. It's part of Yemen.
Part of Yemen, yes, of course.
Yeah, and I was there for a week, and my 1 week trip got cut back to 5 days because the pandemic was shutting everything down, and we got woken up at our campsite at sort of like 2 a.m. and told, get to the airport because flights everywhere in the world are closing down. And we did get to the airport, and we then spent a whole day sitting in the airport in Aden, which is part of the Houthis have been bombing it any second. They have bombed it since then.
Mm-hmm.
And then got to Egypt, to Cairo, and I spent the night in Cairo, flew from Cairo via somewhere, it might have been Dubai, it might have been Abu Dhabi, back to Australia, and got to Australia another day or two, and I wouldn't have been allowed in. So my last night before the pandemic effectively was Cairo.
Right. Yeah. It just shows that borders will change and fade and move, but we have always got somewhere new to travel to, which is brilliant. So now I'm going to ask you the question that we ask all our guests. What is your most bizarre travel experience? I can't wait to hear this one.
I think sometimes just bumping into someone in a totally weird place. And a woman I know in Melbourne, and it isn't like I'm searching for her, but I have twice in the last month seen her. Once I found myself behind her in a supermarket queue, nowhere near where she lived. And once I just saw her just a few days ago. We were both in the atrium at Fed Square, and she just walked by. And I once bumped into her in Norway. Now, what on earth was she doing in Norway? But my weirdest and nicest experience in the last year or two, I was traveling with a British journalist friend of mine. We were driving across the northern U.S. We started in Milwaukee, and we ended up in Fargo in North Dakota. And we drove through Hibbing, Minnesota, which is where any Bob Dylan fans would know it was where Bob Dylan grew up. And we drove by the Bob Dylan High School, and there's now a Nobel Prize monument out front saying, this is a high school with a Nobel Prize winner, where the Nobel Prize winner went to his entire high school years. And Simon and I then drove down the street a few blocks to the house where he lived when he was a teenager. And there was a guy out front mowing the lawn, and we sort of stopped and said hello. And within 5 minutes, we were invited into the house to look around. This guy owned Bob Dylan's house, and he took us upstairs and said, well, this was Bob Dylan's bedroom. This is where Bob got out of bed every morning when his mother woke him up, went downstairs and had breakfast and walked off to high school. And I thought, that's an experience you would just not have unless you happen to drive by the house, see someone outside, get talking to him, and before you know it, getting invited inside. Wonderful.
Fascinating. Can I ask, was he a fan of Bob Dylan's music?
He was a big fan.
Good.
What he'd more or less done was he'd bought the Bob Dylan house, and he'd bought the house next door to live in, and he was sort of trying to restore the house to the way it would have been when Bob lived there. He was putting old dial phones in and so on. And Simon and I said, this is a bit like going to Paul McCartney's and John Lennon's house in Liverpool, which a lot of people do. The National Trust in Britain owns the houses. And he said, yeah, I've been to those. He said, the only trouble is Liverpool gets lots of tourists. Hibbing, Minnesota does not.
I love it. And just the bizarreness of the whole thing. So you're always on the road still. You seem that you're never off the road. I just want to ask you one last question. As somebody who's been in the publishing industry all, for the last Goodness, how many years are we talking? 45,
A lot.
50, okay, a lot of years. Can you give us a little reading list? I did have a look on your website for your you had a Darklands reading list. What are you reading?
That was a long time ago.
Yeah, so you need to...
I just got a message a day or so ago, a couple of years ago. I read a book called Dust on My Shoes, written by an Australian traveling across Asia just after World War II. And, it was kind of chaotic in a lot of places. And there was a civil war going on in Greece. So, Greece was a war zone, could you believe it? And he wrote this book, and he was Australian, and I could not find a copy in a library in Melbourne. And but then in London, the library near me in London, they had a copy. It hadn't been borrowed for about 40 years, but they found it in their archives within minutes. I was really impressed with how they pulled this book off the shelf, and I read it, and I blogged about it. And this guy said to me, I can't find a copy. Where'd you get yours? And I told him you have to go to London to borrow it. And I just had an email from him saying he found a copy in a second-hand bookshop, and I forget where in Australia, but somewhere in Australia. And this copy had been borrowed from a library in Scotland in 1976 and never returned. Oh. And I thought, I ends up in a second-hand bookshop. And I thought that was great. So Dust on My Shoes. And about the same time, I read another book called The Towers of Trebizond, which was a novel about traveling around Turkey in the 50s. And that's still, it might even be in print still. A weird and wacky and wonderful book. And I really enjoyed that. I've just finished reading, and I just, it's a mega bestseller. We Need to Talk About Kevin. And I just hated the book because Kevin we needed to do more than talk about Kevin. We needed to put a bullet through Kevin's head. Yeah, but the kid was a monster. Well, he killed people. But funnily enough, the main character in the book is running a travel publishing house, what did she call it? A Wing and a Prayer. That was the name of it. And a couple of times in the book, she compares it to Rough Guides and Lonely Planet. And I've actually met Lionel Shriver, the author of We Need to Talk About Kevin. And I hadn't read the book at that time. And she never mentioned I sort of stole this idea from you. There's 3 books.
Okay, thank you so much for those recommendations. Tony, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on The World Awaits. We will put in our show notes those book recommendations and also your website, and we can't wait to see what you do next.
What an amazing legacy that Tony and Maureen leave. And it's great to hear he travels with carry-on only, even with a laptop in there as well. And also how the world still holds surprises for even the most well-travelled person. Our tip this week is about the best cities to visit without a car. So the Compare the Market Index ranks 25 cities around the world and takes 8 different factors into account relating to urban mobility, accommodation and activities. And top of the list was... Paris!
Paris! Yay! And the other 2 top cities to visit car-free were Berlin and Amsterdam. They all got high scores because of good urban design, public transport and pedestrian-focused infrastructure.
Mm. And Paris in particular has actually been pushing really hard in recent years to reduce the reliance on cars because of the Olympics. So the Olympics that are coming up this year. So it's worked really hard to make sure the city's more accommodating. So, without having to have a car, which is obvious because, much more tourist friendly. So they've actually also added to their network of bike lanes.
I was in Paris middle of last year. I've got to say, you really have to respect the bike lanes because the cyclists in Paris take no prisoners. If you are standing on the bike lane, you deserve to have some just about run Copenhagen. Your feet.
Yes. Yes, I know. I nearly got knocked over in Copenhagen.
I think everybody. Yeah, Paris, it was actually quite a shock. But, that's obviously why it's rating so well here. The bottom 3 cities to visit, car-free, are Dallas, Houston and Atlanta. So sorry, USA, you really lucked out on this one.
We're giving the USA a hard time.
Oh, I know. We're giving him a ribbing today. Some American cities, however, did do better, like New York and San Francisco. But for the most part, American, Canadian and Australian cities didn't do that well, largely, I think, due to the sheer tyranny of distance. You know, old European cities are so much more compact than our sprawling Australian cities.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's important to know, because this is all very important for you to know, because getting around a city without a car lets you explore it in a much more personal way. I've said multiple times before, I love just walking or biking around a city. So obviously, if you're just going to drive from A to B, you miss the little gems along the way, and you also miss local life. I just love nothing more than going somewhere and seeing the way people live their lives. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper into this, you can visit comparethemarket.com.au. There's a bit of a long link to this research, so we will put it all in the show notes so you can best plan your next car-free holiday. Next week, I'm chatting with Louis Thompson of Nomadic Escapes about his net zero, nature-positive, sustainable pods. They were recognised by the UN as one of the most innovative startups in rural tourism.
Well, I can't wait to hear that. And he has some interesting thoughts too on how AI is going to influence travel in the off-grid space.
If you'd like to help support our production costs, you can buy us a coffee at coffee.com/theworldawaits. That's ko-fi.com/theworldawaits. And that will help us continue to bring you inspirational travel interviews with the world's best.
That's a wrap for The World Awaits this week. Click to subscribe anywhere you listen to your favourite pods. And where can people find you, Kirsty?
I'm at Kirsty Writes on Instagram. That's KIRSTIE Writes, WRITES. And where can people find you, Belle?
You can find me at globalsalsa.com or on Insta at global_salsa.
Thanks for listening. See you next week.